the last several months, we've been walking through a series on prayer, and this morning we come to the last sermon in this series. Honestly, we could preach on prayer for a year and only be scratching the surface of how profound prayer should be in our lives. The Gallup poll was taken, and they tracked many different opinions, but according to the Gallup poll, 90% of Americans say that they pray, and 86% of Americans say that they believe in God. I find that a little interesting that more say they pray than they believe in God. I guess that other 4% are praying, they just don't believe there's anybody to hear their prayer. 83% say that they're in favor of prayer at a graduation exercise. 70% of Americans say that they're in favor of Christian prayer in schools. That may be what America says, but we believe in prayer. I would say probably most of us here that we believe that prayer is a spiritual connection God intends to make with our lives every day. And Jesus is trying to teach his disciples of the need to be persistent in prayer. So if you look in Luke chapter 18 this morning, Jesus tells a parable, rather unusual parable, but it's something that was probably common experience for the disciples. They knew this story to not just be a story. They knew it to be true in reality. Luke chapter 18, Jesus is going to teach us some principles about being persistent in prayer. Beginning in verse 1, he says, and he was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart. And this is what he said. In a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. For a while he was unwilling, but afterwards he said to himself, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? In ancient times, and these disciples would recognize this when they heard the story. It was just a common thing. They knew that women did not have many rights in ancient times. And so this was probably a story they were familiar with. The widow was probably being cheated out of land that had been left her by her deceased husband, and that somebody came and that they were trying to take her land. You can look all the way back in the Old Testament, the story of Ruth. And Ruth and Naomi were widows, and whenever they came back, if it weren't for Boaz as the kinsman redeemer, then they wouldn't have had any hope. They would have been paupers for the rest of their lives. And so this was probably fairly familiar. And in the parable, he talks about an adversary, that she not only had this adversary who was trying to steal her land, but as well that there was a wicked king, a wicked judge. And that was probably, the disciples probably had somebody in mind whenever that name came up. It's kind of like, because most of the judges were Gentile judges appointed by the Roman authority, and the business of the day was according to bribery. This widow didn't have anything that she could bribe the judge with, so she just continually came to him. That was kind of a common practice of that day for a judge to be able to have the authority by the Romans, and then for him to take the bribes and for him to become rich and profitable at other people's expense. Well, when you look at this widow didn't have anything, so she just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And it says in verse 5 that she came bothering him. Literally, that term can mean that she poked him in the eye. I don't know if you've ever been poked in the eye, but if that's what he felt like, I'm going to have to, I don't care what people think, and I'm not afraid of God, but she keeps poking me in the eye. I'm going to do this for my own sake. And that's really what he's telling her. In this story, Jesus is trying to show the disciples that we ought to pray, and we ought to be persistent in prayer. So there's three principles that I want to point out. First of all, Jesus is telling them, and the Holy Spirit is telling us, don't worry, pray instead. I am probably needing to hear this more than anybody in this room. I probably am more guilty of worry than anybody in this room. So I want to take this to heart. But what he tells us, this widow, she didn't just sit at home and she didn't just say, oh, what am I going to do? Oh, my goodness. And that she didn't fret over this. Instead, she went to the only person that could help her. She went to the judge. And she, in verse 1, it says, he was telling them this parable to show them at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart. That word of the phrase, not to lose heart, in the Greek can be translated, don't give up, or not to lose heart. But it literally means, don't be filled with bad thoughts, with troubled thoughts. And that's what worry is. Worry is like this little trickle of doubt that starts in our mind, and then it turns into this puddle of despair, and it grows into this stream of frustration, and then it goes into a storm of distress and into a tsunami that just is overwhelming that we can't escape. And that's what worry will do in our life. Instead of worrying, we ought to come to the point that we believe that we can trust God with this and that we ought to be able to pray. One of the most profound statements about worry that I've ever read was written by a man, William Ward. Listen to what he says. Worry is faith in the negative, trust in the unpleasant, assurance of disaster, and belief in defeat. Worry is a magnet that attracts negative circumstances. Listen, worry is wasting today's time to clutter up tomorrow's opportunities with yesterday's troubles. Worry is wasting today's time to clutter up tomorrow's opportunities with yesterday's trouble. Worry is like a rocking chair. It'll give you something to do, but you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to accomplish anything. And what this widow teaches us is that you don't just sit around and worry, that you need to pray. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach them, is that as you think about that, don't just be filled about the darkness of your circumstances. Bring that before God. Paul was stuck in a dark, damp dungeon. He was chained to Roman guards. But he didn't worry about just his circumstances. He didn't just think about where he was. He believed that God had a purpose to serve, that he trusted God. That's where he wrote Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. And I like the way Eugene Peterson paraphrases this. This is what he says. Remember his circumstances. In the dungeon in Rome, facing his soon-to-be death, that his head's going to be cut off, chained to guards. But this is what he says. Don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praise shape your worry into prayers. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. So when you're faced with challenging circumstances, you can do one of two things. You can either worry, you can let it fill your heart with troubled thoughts. You can be concerned about it and let it grow into that you can't do anything about it, or you can pray. Angel Martinez was a great preacher of yesteryear. He is famous because he had such a dynamic memory. He was able to memorize many books of the Bible. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. He memorized the whole book of Matthew, but he was an evangelist. And he told a story about an owner of a construction company. This man was facing financial problems within his company, and he was worried about it. But he was a Christian, and every morning he got up and he read a devotional. And in that particular morning, his devotional used the passage from the book of Matthew chapter 6 and verse 26. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And then the devotional talked about not to worry, that we ought to pray. And at the end of the devotion, it used 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Cast your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Just a few days earlier, he had on the construction site, there was a tree that had a nest with some baby birds in it. And so he told them to hold off taking down that tree, and he waited and he waited. But that day he knew the tree had to come down or it was going to delay the project and make it even worse. So what he did is he went out and he got into a bucket truck and had to lift it up, and he looked over, and he had waited long enough that those baby birds had grown and learned to fly, and they were gone. And he thought, how neat. He had waited long enough to give those birds a chance, and they were able to fly away. And so he took the nest down and thought this will be a reminder and an encouragement in the future. And birds' nests, made of twigs and straw and just anything they can get. And there was a little fragment of a piece of paper, and as he pulled it out, it just simply said, God cares. He said from that moment on, he never worried again, because he knew the God of heaven, the God of the universe, cared for him. And what else could life hold for him? Don't worry, pray. The second principle that we are taught by this widow is don't worry, pray. But second of all, don't quit. This widow didn't just come and she didn't just petition the judge and then go home and say, okay, I've done all I can do. It says that she came back over and over and over and over again. This widow was persistent. She kept coming back. You look in the Bible and you see where David was not a man who was a once a day kind of prayer guy. David was a man who prayed consistently. David continued to come before the Lord. Psalm 55 and verses 16 and 17, he says, I call to God and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress and he hears my voice. He prayed every day. He prayed all day. You look at other examples in the Old Testament. Hannah felt like God was going to gift her with a child, but she was barren. And so she continued to pray, and she prayed and prayed. And finally, God gave her the mighty prophet Samuel was her child. Think about in the Bible as Jesus even stood in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that Jesus continued to pray. And it's in the present perfect. We know he prayed it 3 times, but he kept praying, Father, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And he continued in prayer until God, the Father, gave him resolve to face the cross. You think about Paul again. Paul had some kind of physical affliction, and it was a painful affliction. A lot of scholars believe it may have been because of the beatings that Paul had taken. It may have been something, we know he had something with his eyesight. Personally, I think it was kidney stones, but whatever it was, Paul was in pain. And so we know that he came and he asked God to relieve him of this. And he prayed that. And then he prayed it again. And he prayed it again. And finally, God gave him the answer, my grace is sufficient for you. And from that day on, it changed Paul's prayer. And Paul learned to understand that he could, through that, even though it was painful for him, that he could pray for God to get glory even through that. That God's grace was sufficient for him. I know I do kid about kidney stones, and some of y'all, when you hear about kidney stones, you get tired of hearing about that. But I can say within my own life, this is very personal for me, that some of the most powerful movements of God in my life and some of the most dynamic, powerful sermons I've ever preached was in the midst of pain. And it was at a time when I was the one that had no doubt that it was God, because it was not only beyond what I could, but even what I should do at times. And God's able to take situations that seem like to the world, and if we just look at the moment that we'd say, oh, I just can't go on, I'm going to quit. And God will take those times and he will use those as most powerful times to bring glory to his name. Don't quit. Pray. You know what the largest organization in America is? The Quitters Club. Oh, you've never heard it because all the members have quit. They don't have national advertising because none of them, they quit paying their dues. And they don't know how to stick it out and to work through anything. They don't know how to work through problems in marriage. They just quit. They don't know what it means to work through a tough job. They just quit. They don't know what it means to be able to have a positive attitude in the midst of pain or in the midst of sickness, because they just give up on that and they worry about that all the time. They just quit. And what God is trying to teach us here is don't quit. You pray. Some of the best people in the world, some of the greatest people in the world are folks who get knocked down. I heard a story about a young man that got hired as a scout over at the University of Alabama, and he went in to talk to the legend Bear Bryant. And Bear Bryant said, now I want to make sure that you're going to know what kind of player I'm looking for. And he said, okay, Coach, you tell me what I need to look for. And he said, you know, you're going to see one of these young men, and whenever he's out there that he's going to get knocked down and he just won't get up. And the scout said, we don't want that player. He says, right, we don't want him. But then you got that player who'll get knocked down and he'll get up. But he gets knocked down really hard and he won't get up. And the scout said, we don't want that player. He said, no, we don't want that player either. He said, but then you got that young man and he'll get knocked down hard and he'll get up. And he'll get knocked down hard and he'll get up. And he'll get knocked down hard and he just keeps getting up. And the scout said, now that's the player we're looking for. And Barry Bryant looked at him and said, no, it's not. I want you to go get that boy that's knocking all them others down. Great people get knocked down. Emmitt Smith could be classified as the greatest NFL runner of all times. Not as flashy as a Walter Payton or a Adrian Peterson, but he ran for a career of 18,355 yards. That's a little less than 10 and a half yards. Well, over a career, that may not seem like long, 10 and a half yards, but when you consider there were 11 defensive players trying to take his head off, and for every yard that he had to fight for those. He had more 1,000-yard seasons with 11 than any other player. He had more 100-yard games than any other player, 78 games over 100 yards. He gained those 18,355 and averaged carry a little over 4 yards per carry. He was a great runner. But you know what that also means? It means he got knocked down 4,268 times. 4,268 times he got knocked down. He was not only a great runner, he was somebody who kept getting up. And that is what prayer ought to teach us, is even when we get knocked down, and get knocked down, and get knocked down, we keep getting up because we can pray. And we can place our faith in the one who gives us the strength. His grace truly is sufficient. The third principle of persistent prayer is do not doubt. Instead, pray. Now, there's no doubt that the widow represents us, but the judge doesn't represent God. A parable shows comparisons, but a parable also shows contrast. And that's what Jesus is trying to say. Look in verses 7 and 8 again. He says, will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry out day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. We need to expect God to answer our prayer. When you pray, do you pray with faith, believing God's going to answer your prayer? Do you really expect God to answer your prayer? Because if you're not praying, expecting God to do something, then your prayers won't be answered. Because you're not really praying. You're just talking. Prayer means I am expecting a spiritual connection to happen in my life. James chapter 1 and verses 5 through 7 says, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord. When you take those words and you couple those with the positive promise of 1 John chapter 5 and verse 14, it says, this is the confidence which we have before him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the request which we have asked from him. God always answers prayer. Now, sometimes God answers prayer quickly. Back in the parable in verse 8, it says, I tell you that he'll bring about justice for them quickly. Quickly is a relative term, isn't it? If something happened and somebody said, call 911 quickly, then you'd mean hurry up, call them right now. But if two people met and from their introductions they were married 2 months later, you'd say, oh, they married quickly. Well, if you say call 911 quickly and you waited 2 months, you wouldn't consider that quickly, would you? It's a relative term. Really what the word can mean is suddenly. And sometimes I'm afraid that we as believers that we don't allow that connection, that sometimes God answers our prayer quickly. He answers them suddenly, and we miss out that it's God working because we call it coincidence. There was a lady who pulled into the parking lot at Walmart, and she realized it was raining. It was just pouring down raining. It was raining cats and dogs, and she'd forgotten her umbrella. And so she prayed, Lord, just help me get a parking place close to the door. And then immediately she saw the taillights of a car that was backing out, and she said, never mind, God, I see one already. She lost sight that it was an answer to prayer immediately. And if we're not careful, that we will say, oh, well, that just was going to happen. That was just a coincidence. So many times God answers us, and that we don't understand it's an answer to prayer because we don't expect a spiritual connection. We don't expect that God's really there and listening, that He's working within us. There have been so many times in my life, and I can tell you almost every day of my life, that God brings that reality to me that I can pray something and it happens. Some of those times just seems to stick out in our mind. I was sitting in my office one Sunday morning, and it was just pouring down rain. And I prayed, Lord, I know that there's some people who are home right now who are making the decision whether they're going to come to church or not. And whenever they look out and they see it raining, that they won't come to church. So, Lord, I'm just going to ask you to stop the rain. And immediately, it was like cutting off a valve. Immediately, the rain stopped. And the Lord answered my prayer. That made a spiritual connection. I remember driving down a road not too long ago. It was overcast, and I said, Lord, I'm a little discouraged today, a little down today. Lord, I just need you to say something to me. Just make yourself very real to me. And all of a sudden, in that overcast sky, it's like it parted, and a beam of sunshine, just one beam of sunshine came down upon the road. And it's like God said, I'm here. Just look for that spiritual connection. Sometimes God answers our prayer quickly. And sometimes God answers our prayer later. We have to keep on praying. And we have to claim that God's timing is impeccable. And our timing is imperfect. And that we stay persistent in our prayer. We stay faithful in our prayer. And we pray, Lord, if this is your will, then Lord, I pray. And then as it is accomplished, that you know that God's timing. So sometimes God answers prayer later. Sometimes God answers prayer better. What we pray for, and God does even more, and He gives us something better. I really thought whenever I was coming out of high school, I'd go off and be a collegiate athlete. Then I would go off to seminary, and straight out of seminary that I'd just go straight to Pastor First Baptist, Dallas, Texas. I just knew that's what the plan was. That wasn't God's plan at all. You know what? God's plan was to give me a better school to go to. I wound up at Blue Mountain College. They didn't even have a track team. I had plans to marry a girl that I dated in high school. She was going to go to pharmacy school, and I was going to be pastor at First Baptist Dallas. Our lives were set. God had a better plan. He gave me Leanne. And God gave me a better plan than going to First Baptist Church Dallas. He brought me to First Baptist Church West Point. That was a better plan. God sometimes says, I know what you're asking for, but I got something better in store for you. But we need to expect to hear from Him. And then sometimes God answers prayer by telling us, no, not in that way. I'll share with you the most pertinent story within my own life. Several of you watched and prayed and helped through a time with my mother. My mother was just a godly woman, and we got a call. My mom had a stroke, and she had recovered really well. Her left side was a little weak from that, but she made a really good recovery. And then one morning that we got a call, my mother in January was out walking around McAlpin Lake in Amory in her nightgown. And so I rushed over, and all the family rushed in. We took her to the hospital. The result, they said she's probably had a mini stroke, and she seemed fine after that. A few days later, or maybe a week later, she called me, and I could tell on the phone that she was so confused. So I went over and had her checked out. They said she probably had another mini stroke, and they made schedule for some other tests and all. But that day I took her, and we went up to Greenwood Springs and Splunge and back up in that area to where she grew up. And as we rode through there, then her mind started clicking, and she started telling me where the old house place of where everybody in that community lived. We went up to Land Cemetery, and it's just up on a little hill, there are 7 little graves of a family that had 7 children, either stillborn or died soon after they were born. And her mother, my grandmother, was there as a midwife to help. And my mother remembered the names of all 7 of those little children. And so whenever, as it progressed and we found out she had dementia, as it progressed, there'd be times that she would get so confused. I'd put her in the car, and we'd go back up to Greenwood Springs and Splunge, and her memory would come back, and she'd be better. And I was praying. My prayer was, God, heal my mother. Lord, let her come to the end of her life, and let her have that dignity of remembering how much she is loved and how much she has blessed us all. Until one day, finally, I took her up there, and even in that familiar spot, she didn't know where she was. And we were coming back on Highway 8, and she looked at me, and she said, I'm sorry, who are you? There's nothing that has broken my heart anymore. Dementia and Alzheimer's, most cruel diseases that can be. It's hard to watch somebody go through physical pain and suffering, certainly. But it is horrible to watch somebody lose their memories. For a long time, my mother didn't know who I was. For a long time, she thought I was my daddy, so she was mad at me all the time. Just days before she died, my prayers had changed. I wasn't praying, God, heal my mother. I was just praying, God, keep her from pain. And God said, Dale, I'm going to heal your mother, but not in the way you're praying for. I'm going to heal her completely. And he did. And he called her home to heaven. But I had such a peace. It wasn't that God was saying no just because he was saying no. He was saying, no, I've got a better plan. I've got a more complete plan. And you need to just trust me through it. And whenever I came to that realization, then I had peace. And whenever God called my mama home, I had already mourned for my mother. I rejoiced. And God called her home to complete healing. C.S. Lewis said, prayer is request. The essence of a request, as distinct from a demand, is that it may or may not be granted. And if an infinitely wise being listens to the request of finite and foolish creatures, of course he will sometimes grant them and sometimes refuse them. If God had granted all the silly prayers I've made in my life, where would I be now? I'm reminded of the story in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob was wrestling with an angel. And as he wrestled, finally he had him in a full Nelson. I know that from watching years of wrestling on television. And finally he said, Jacob, you need to let me go. Sun's coming up. And he said, I'll not let you go until you bless me. I'll not let you go until you bless me. And finally he reached down and he touched his hip. And he pulled his hip out of socket. Jacob, from that point, his name was changed. Jacob means supplanter. It really means a grabber. He grabbed onto his brother's heel. He was a grabber. He was a deceiver. He grabbed for things in life. But whenever he was touched, then he changed his name to Israel, which means a prince of God. He went from one who was a grabber to one who was on the throne, the prince. He changed the way that he walked. When he touched his hip, you could see him for miles to come. You could watch him, and you know, here comes Israel. You know how I know that? It's because he walks differently. Sometimes as we're walking through this life, we feel like we are disjointed. But whenever God touches us and we're persistent and we hold on to him, he changes us from a grabber to a prince. Listen, don't worry. Pray. Don't give up. Pray. And pray. And pray. Let's pray together.